Is it possible to be a successful music composer living anywhere in the world? Let's talk about it.
Here we are live. I'm here with Chris Porter all the way in Japan, and this is episode 10 of Sonic Storytellers. Today's topic is very interesting. I think it's going to be really helpful for all the listeners. Topic is how to be a successful composer living anywhere in the world. And so I figured the best person to ask for this is my fellow video game composer, Chris, at cportermusic.com. I think I got that right. And he lives all the way in Japan. And so we were just laughing about how our schedules are so different that it is actually 7 a.m. for me in Atlanta, Georgia, and it is 9 p.m. for him over in Japan. So I just think it's tremendous that with technology we can even have a chat like this. It's going to be really, really helpful for you guys. And we'll get into the Japan part, I think, at the end of the talk, because I think that's a really fascinating subject. It's going to help a lot of people, because that is a question we get a lot, is do you have to live in LA? Do you have to live in New York? And I think it's a very clear no to that you can be successful living anywhere in the world. But before we dive into this chat, I think it's really important to just kind of throw out a disclaimer that when we use this word successful, being a successful music composer, I think that can have a lot of connotations. I think ultimately the goal is to be a full-time musician. And I get that a lot, just having worked with thousands of students over the last several years. That seems to be the trend, is everybody wants to be a full-time musician, because not everybody needs to be a full-time composer. And I think something that Chris and I both share is that we are both educators as well as composer. I think this is going to hit in a lot of different places with different people, especially beginners, but also those who have been doing music for a long time and maybe just looking to break into writing music to have maybe a greater percentage of their income to come from the music production, music composition side. So I think there's a lot we can talk about here. I'm really excited about it. But just to give a quick overview, we're going to be chatting about how we get our first composition gigs, how to develop relationships with game developers in particular, and just kind of any advice we might have for composers starting off with their business and how to get more work along the process. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Chris. And Chris, if you don't mind, just before we start, can you give us a little background about how you became a composer and how you landed your very first composing gig?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to say, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. This is a real pleasure. My first podcast, so pretty awesome. So I appreciate it. So first off, a little clarification. I am a teacher, but I'm not a music teacher. No, I'm an English teacher here. So on to your question. So my start with music, I would say, well, I started playing guitar in high school, maybe around, it was either my 10th or 11th grade. I ended up getting a black and white Squier, Fender Squier, and taught myself a few chords and jammed with some friends. And I had a really cheap, maybe a Casio keyboard or something, and I kind of plucked around on that. So my beginnings were just all just kind of playing, Never took any formal lessons, nothing like that.
Wow.
And still haven't. I've never had any music lessons. So it just started with a love for music, a love for playing guitar, and eventually I kind of focused on my love of video games and my love of video game music, and I was like, hey, I'd really love to write music like that now, and I didn't know where to start. So maybe, I don't have my timeline exactly right, but maybe around 2003 or so, my uncle bought me a computer, and it had Cakewalk, Music Creator, 2003 or something like that, loaded onto it, and I was like, all right, there it is, my first DAW, and the rest is history. I just kind of started learning the ins and outs of that, and
Wow. So how would you say your very first composition gig came? Was it just music that you created and sold to somebody, or was it a developer that you came in contact with? How did that come about?
Okay, yeah. So my first actual gig was many, many years later. So I was writing music for fun, since then. My first actual game gig was for a game called Why Is the Princess in a Magic Forest? Before then I had been really, really wanting to work on games, but I had no idea how to do it. I didn't know who to contact. I was like, how do people even find their first gig? So in a desperate attempt to find work, I just put a post on Facebook. I was like, hey, does anybody know anybody that's working on a game that I could write music for? And somebody chimed in. It was an old friend of mine from when I was studying abroad at Kyushu University a few years prior to that. He was back at Kyushu getting his master's degree, I think, and one of his classmates, Michael, was making a game, and he said, hey, let me put you in touch with him. So he put us in touch, and I sent him a few examples of my work, and he was like, yeah, I'd love to work with you. So it was really just luck that my friend just happened to see that post, and he happened to know somebody, and he wasn't a music guy at all. He just happened to, he wasn't a game guy at all. He just happened to know that Michael was making games, and wasn't even sure if he had a composer lined up or anything. So yeah, it was very very fortunate.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what was the style of music that you were writing before the game to show him, and what do you think actually made him want to hire you?
Oh, that's a good question, because you know how we are, right? We're very critical of our even our most recent work, let alone our old work. So at the time, I had done my best work, and looking back on it, I'm not sure what he saw in it. But I was composing, I've always been a big fan of RPGs, so I had composed a lot of like town music and battle music and things like that. So I believe that the music that I sent him was probably in that vein, kind of adventurous. The game itself, we'll just call it Magic Forest from now on. It's a mouthful to say the whole title. So Magic Forest is kind of a puzzle game, but it's set in like a fantasy forest, So I think my RPG style kind of fit that pretty well. So I think he saw a match there.
Really cool. Yeah, so how would you say that you've cultivated relationships since that point? And I'm curious, have you worked with that same developer since then?
Okay, yeah, so, Magic Forest was a very, very long production. I took some notes. I was researching this before this started. So I joined that project in June of 2013, and the game didn't release until November of 2016. And it's a quite a small game. You wouldn't think that it would need that long, but Michael was, aside from myself and another guy who did sound effects, he did everything. He was programming it by himself. He did all of the art, everything, basically everything except for the art and the music and the sound effects. We had a long time to become friends. We were working on it for so long with each other, and we ended up actually showcasing that game at Tokyo Game Show in 2015, which was amazing. Over the course of working on that game together, we developed a good friendship, and I met up with him twice. And I should have said that he was living in Fukuoka, like I said, where I was studying abroad originally. He ended up graduating with his doctorate in game design, and moved to Tokyo, and is now a teacher teaching games, teaching how to make games in Tokyo. And I went and visited him a few times. So we were able to cultivate a very good friendship just from the game itself. Since then, no, we have not worked on anything together, but he is working on another game right now. It's in like the early stages, and he has contacted me about music. So hopefully that's a gig in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how fascinating is it that from the start you were already technically working globally? You were already working with people not living right beside you. And I think I've had very similar experiences where my very first game, still located in the United States, but other side of the country, my very first game. And that was actually through Kickstarter, of all things. I just reached out to a team that was making a game. They didn't have a composer. I said, hey, I think my style fits this perfectly. And very similar to you, I hadn't actually technically written anything that fits that game. Like I didn't write a demo for them, whatever. It was like, hey, I think my music can fit, you know? I just think it's super cool that with technology these days, we can truly, that's kind of the theme of this chat anyway, is that we can live anywhere in the world and still do this and still be in connection with other creatives, and particularly with game developers. I think that's really neat. So I'm curious, what were some of the other games that you've had over the last several years? It sounds like 2013 was really the start of game composition in the marketplace, so to speak, selling games. I've seen that you've had a lot of games on Steam. So how has that process gone about over the last several years, getting in contact with those developers? Was it a result of this job, or was it some other circumstance?
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, to talk about working with people globally, I should mention that Michael is from the Netherlands. So I was working with a guy from the Netherlands. I'm from the U.S. We're both living in Japan, but in different cities. It's just,
that's great.
Like how much more distant can you get? But yeah, it worked out really well. Okay, so as for other games, so my timeline's really screwy because, like I said, the Magic Forest was a very long production. So even though that was the first game that I started working on, it wasn't the first game that was released or my first soundtrack that was released. The first game that I ever worked on that was actually released was a very, very small Android game called Bird Hunter, and it was a complete, Duck Hunt clone, which was fine. I mean, we weren't trying to break new ground. It was really just like a project. Like, hey, can we make something? We had a few features that stood out and made it different from the NES game, and it was all custom graphics and everything. And I did completely custom music for that. So that was actually my first release game. The next kind of big game that also came out before Magic Forest was released, even though I started working on it after, was a game called Ikenie. And Ikenie was a game jam game. Well, a game jam in a sense. It was a contest game for IGMC, IGMC 2016. So the way IGMC works is you have 30 days to make a complete game. So we started in January. I don't remember now. I don't remember what month it was, but we started in the beginning of a month and we ended at the end of the month. We had a complete game on our hands. So the way I got that gig was actually posting a classifieds ad on the RPG Maker forums. I just was like, hey, I'm a composer. Here's some of my work. I'd love to work on a game if you have one, and I got a few, I'll go into later gigs that I got from that as well, but the guy, Nicholas, who created Ikenia, he contacted me, and it was very interesting because I had written a track that was on my SoundCloud called Relict, and he had listened to that. That was in like my tracks in my post. I was like, here's some stuff I've done, and he was like, hey, this game that I have planned for IGMC, your track Relic would fit absolutely perfect. It's like you made this track for my game, and I had never seen his game before. So I ended up licensing that track to his game, and then he brought me on, and I wrote the rest of the soundtrack original for it. So anyway, we created Ikenia, and we were very happy with it. After it was released for IGMC, we ended up he ended up kind of like going back into it and fleshing it out and actually adding new kind of stages, and I wrote some more music for it and everything. And anyway, so that was like his first kind of big game project. Since then, I've been in touch with him constantly. He's a great friend of mine, who I've never met in person, of course. But yeah, so his next game that he made was kind of a longer game. It wasn't a game jam. It wasn't for IGMC. He just kind of took his time with it, and that was called Room 42. So because we worked so well together on Ikenia, it was he contacted me immediately. He didn't even think to contact anybody else. He was just like, yeah, I'm working on another game. Love to have you join it. And just like with Ikenie, I had written a couple tracks since Ikenie, and he was like, dude, this would be great in my game. So again, just even if I wasn't working on a game, I was writing music, which I think is very important. I'm constantly writing music, whether I have a project to work on or not. And that some of those tracks ended up in future games, so that's something to keep in mind. So anyway, Room 42, that came out, and then right after that was released, they announced that IGMC 2017 was about to take place, and so he was like, dude, let's do it. Just like Ikenie, we're gonna do another IGMC.
Real quick, what does IGMC stand for?
Indie Game Maker Challenge. Contest. Hold on. Is contest or challenge? Hold on. Indie Game Maker Contest. Indie Game Maker Contest.
Yeah, we're using acronyms. I want to make sure listeners are following.
Yeah, so 2017, it was our second IGMC together. And again, he brought me on to write music. Again, there was a track that I had written that he just needed to have in the game, and I composed the rest of the soundtrack, from scratch. And that game was called Yomotsu. And that game, I don't want to brag, but I don't mean to boast, but that game ended up winning first prize of IGMC 2017. We were just like,
and I've heard that soundtrack, and it's fantastic.
Thank you.
I think it may be your best work to date, from what I've heard.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. It's strange too, because if you look at my released soundtracks, it's almost atypical of the type of music that I actually love to compose, or that I usually do. And the reason why the released soundtracks aren't representative of the actual music that I'd like to do more of is because I like to write RPG music. I like to write fantasy and orchestral. And Yomotsu is a very kind of dark and gritty and lots of electric guitars and driving percussion, which is a great fun to write. I love it. It's so much fun. But it's not my dream is to do RPGs, and RPGs, they take a long time to develop. A while back, I started working on a game called Turn Back Time with the developer, and the game, it's kind of gone really well, and then it kind of dips, and then we don't really do anything with it for a while. And anyway, we're not sure what's going to happen with that game, but I ended up writing 30 tracks for that, 30 RPG tracks, so orchestral and kind of world music and typical JRPG fare. So right there is a huge chunk of my production over the past few years is this RPG music that never really got released. And then I'm working on another game called here's another mouthful. It's called A Story of the End - Revere : Episode Dream. So that's another one that I've written about 30 tracks for.
It's a lot of music for games that may not come.
Yeah. Well, A Story of the End is on track to,
okay.
Revere will come out.
Okay, good. Now, would you say though that even if these games don't come out, let's say the game you mentioned before this, would you not still take these and put them on a soundtrack somewhere? I would hope.
Yeah, so of course that's ideal. Basically, I keep the rights to all my music. If the game is released, then that music belongs to that game. In terms of I'm not going to license it out to anywhere else. But it's still my music, and I always make sure that I keep those rights. If the game is officially canceled, then that music would come back to me, and I could do whatever I want with it.
And is that outlined in your written agreement?
It is, and we've spoken about it several times. And this developer and I have a great relationship, and of course I don't want to see the game canceled. So those tracks are on hold for him until he tells me that the game's done.
Just kind of moving on to the next question about what advice we have for composers starting out. I think that is great advice, that you hold on to all the rights to your music. That is something I preach almost every day, because so often there's composers who get into really sticky situations because they didn't fight for their rights. And then what happens is a lot of times with lower budget indie games, which is a space that you and I know very well, usually when it's their first game, they're not very business savvy. And so they're not thinking ahead of, oh no, they don't have an escape clause. They don't have, what if this game does not make it to production? Because usually, game developers get really excited, and sometimes it does take 3 years, 4 years to finish a game, and they have no idea what's going to happen at the end of it. So, what aside from keeping your rights, what other kind of starting off advice do you have specifically for game composers, since that's really the subject of today?
Advice in terms of like contracts and things like that?
It could be business, or it could be composition, anything, just working with a development team for the first time. Because this is about 5 years ago for you. So what advice would you give 5 years ago version of yourself?
Well, I think that number one, be pleasant to work with. I think that's key. It's such an important thing. I'm not going to name any names, but I've been involved with teams where it's just been a disaster because certain members just are not good to work with. They're not team players. And it causes the whole production to fall apart. And it's unfortunate, because you have usually the majority of the team is so with it, and they're so together, and they're so passionate, and they really want to see the project through. But all it takes is just like, one or two people on the team to not, hold up their end of the bargain. Everybody's equally important. So I think number one, go into it knowing that yes, you're doing it for yourself because of course you want to do this and you're trying to advance your career. But you know what? If you're part of a team, you're all working on a product together, a project together. It's not yours. It's not even his or hers. It's everybody's. It's the final product is going to be a culmination of everything that you've all put into it. It's very important that you be as pleasant to work with as possible, and also stick to deadlines. If you say you're gonna hit a deadline, hit that deadline. And if you can't, be very, very honest about it early on. Things happen. We all have personal lives and things happen, but just communicate. I think communication is a very, very important thing.
Yeah, that's extremely important, and that's something that I also talk about a lot with setting deadlines. One of my personal practices is I always kind of do a 1.5x of how long I think it's going to take to do a project, sometimes even 2x. So if I think it's going to take a month to create 5 tracks, 10 tracks, I'll actually give myself 2 months. Because what that does is it creates a little bit of buffer, and you always have to incorporate revisions, because you have no idea, especially with younger teams, if this is their very first game and you haven't worked with this particular person before, you're going to be slower, because every time you make a new track, it's going to have to hit that wall of the developer's ears, and they're going to have to make the decision, do I like this or not? And most times they're not the very first time, but it usually takes 5-10 tracks into the soundtrack before you start to develop that trust. And can you speak on that for a minute? I think that's a good topic. How have your working relationships differed from those you've done multiple projects with versus first time, as far as like how much they trust you and how much freedom they give you starting off?
Sure, yeah. Just to speak a little bit about like revisions, that's absolutely true. Almost every project I've been on is required revisions of some kind. Sometimes they're very large and they require entire rewrites. Sometimes they're just small things, like you'll finish a track and they'll be like, this is perfect the way it is, but it's just like we need a little transition here, just to give their ears a break or something. You know what I mean? So that's another thing to keep in mind. You don't want your music to be too repetitive, so work in little ear breaks if you can. So yeah, like I've only worked with Nicholas multiple times. He's the only composer I've worked with on multiple game projects. Okay. So I can say that things have gone very, very smoothly from the beginning with him, but I would say that Yomotsu, like our most recent one together, we had 30 days, to make that entire game. We were very much in sync. We both just like head down, get the work done, and we got it done. And I don't want to say that wouldn't have happened had we not had the history that we had together, but it probably would have been a little bit more challenging. Having never worked with him before and having such a tight deadline for a game. So if you're working with somebody for the first time, absolutely keep revisions in mind. Like you said, overestimate the amount of time it's going to take. You don't want to promise something and then it's impossible for you to deliver. If you can exceed their expectations, that's great, but give yourself some buffer, as you said.
Yeah, one of my personal mantras is to always under-promise and over-deliver. It's so much better, and it always creates a better relationship than to over-promise and under-deliver, which is the habit that most composers get into because they get very eager and they don't know how long it takes them to write music. And so I think understanding your own writing speed is of paramount importance. And so just a fun question for you, it takes me let me get this right. It takes me 3 hours to write 1 minute of music. Is that about the same for you, or do you think you're a little bit faster, a little bit slower? What do you think?
Oh, it really depends on the amount of instruments I'm using. If it's a very, very detailed orchestra work, it can take anywhere from a day, I would say maybe like 7 or 8 hours, to embarrassingly 40 hours. I've spent. I think I've actually shared a track like that with you a while back. I spent a long time on a battle track.
I remember that,
and I think it was kind of new territory for me, so I was a little out of my element, but I've gotten better since. But certain tracks, if it's not too complicated, especially if I'm using maybe like ensemble patches rather than like composing for individual instruments and things like that. If it doesn't need to be too detailed, I could knock out a track in 3 or 4 hours probably. If it's like solo piano, maybe an hour or two.
Yeah, and so my question for you is, how would you, especially pardon the traffic behind me. You can't avoid it around here.
Yeah.
I've talked to people in Japan, and it's sometimes miserable with all the sirens going by and stuff. Yeah. It's crazy if they're in the city,
I live right next to a school, and they have like announcements over like these loudspeakers on the hour.
Oh, hopefully we can avoid one of those.
No, it's late at night now.
Late
the kids are at home. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. What you just heard was a school bus picking up kids to go to school.
Yeah.
It's so funny. But what business advice do you have for brand new composers in the arena of starting off with their very first game? Because you talked a little bit about the composition side and the speed, but like as far as like how much you should charge, not knowing how long it takes you to write music, that's a very hard thing. Because if I was going to hire, I use this analogy a lot, if I was to hire a painter to come paint my house, would it not be better just to pay them a flat rate to paint the house, and they can take as long as they want to, versus I'm going to charge you by the hour, but we don't know how many rooms you're going to do, we don't know what colors you're going to do. So can you speak on that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally would advise against charging by the hour in terms of work hours. It's just never going to be consistent. Sometimes you'll feel like you're stealing money because you're doing it so quickly, and sometimes you're going to feel like you're making $5 an hour because it's taking you longer than you expected. Personally, I always charge per minute of completed music. There's been exceptions to that where I've agreed to like a share of royalties. I've agreed to a flat rate for a project. Like I'll say, okay, this game needs like 5 or 6 tracks. It'll probably take me about this long or whatever. Like this is about how long those tracks will be. This is their budget. There's a lot of things to consider. But I think that I don't want to say the smartest. What works for me is charging a per minute of finished music rate. I used to kind of adjust my rates based on complexity of the composition. I don't do that anymore. I used to be like, okay, if it's just a solo piano piece, it's this much. If it's like a full orchestra work, it's this much. I stopped doing that because you know what? They're hiring me to write music. If what they ask for is a piano piece, that's what I'll write. If what they're asking for is a full orchestral piece, then that's what I'll give them, you know. But that's totally, it's a very personal thing, you know, your rates and how you decide to charge or not charge.
For what it's worth, I completely agree with you. I've seen that to be true as well. I used to charge based on the complexity, but I have learned the same, that if what basically the developer, or sometimes with film in my case, if the creative is hiring you, it's because they don't know how to solve their problem. And they're hiring you to solve the emotional problem. They need you to elevate their story through sound. They just don't know how to do it. They don't know if it's a piano. They might think they want piano, but ultimately you are the gatekeeper that's going to decide, no, I think this is what this picture needs. This is what this game needs. It's what this emotional moment needs. I think that's what they're really paying us to do, is to tell the story through sound, and then we get to decide how to actually do it. Now, if it only takes us an hour to do 5 piano notes, but it was the right 5 notes, that should be of equal value to a full orchestral score. And it sounds a little harsh to the guy who had to write the full orchestral score, but that's just, you got to know what you're being paid for and what the value of your music actually is. And I think that's what separates the best composers in the world from amateurs. Is amateurs think they have to write this big, massive amount of music for every project, but most times you don't have to. And so I like to usually aim for somewhere in the middle, like to give a little complexity, but also scale it back to enough simplicity that I know that generally it's going to take me about 3 hours to make a minute of music. And that's how I personally base my rates. But again, it is very much project based. And when I do give discounts and things like that, it's never to decrease the value of my work, but rather to work with the budget of the developer. And it's so much more based around their project budget. And basically whatever their budget is, I will find a way to be creative to fit. It might not be the amount of music they want, but I'll find a way to work with them. And I think that's ultimately what they need. They need us to be just creative problem solvers. That's kind of what we do as music composers.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. More often than not, I do have to adjust my rates based on their budget. I'm not a AAA composer. I think you and I both, we work with indie teams mainly. They don't have huge budgets, and whether I'm getting my asking rate, like my first asking rate, or not, the one thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't affect the quality of the music. You're still going to deliver, whether I'm getting paid $1,000 a minute or I'm getting paid, a royalty share. That doesn't matter. It's always about being a good team member, working with them, agreeing on something that you're both happy with. That's another thing. You don't want to go too low, and then feel like you're getting ripped off. And it can actually affect your creativity too. You're like, oh man, like I'm barely making anything here. I feel like I ripped myself off, and you want to try to avoid that too.
Yeah, and just a quick aside before the last question here. I actually just did a video last week sometime about this idea of rates and the importance of, if the budget is so small but you still want to work on the project, you still want to add value to the team, consider non-exclusive music, non-exclusive licenses, or maybe some combo of exclusive and non-exclusive. So for anyone interested more in that subject, I think that's a really great idea to jump into, specifically with really small budgets, but you still want to provide value and you still want to retain rights to your music that you can sell and relicense to other game developers or film creators. I think that's just a really good alternative that still gets your foot in the door, still gets you actively working, and it prevents doing free work. And I think a big part of my story was the first, 5 years or so. I've been writing professionally for about 10 years now, but the first 5 years or so were spent doing a lot of free projects that, looking back, I don't regret working on the games. I regret my poor business decisions, that those people, they didn't have zero budget. They just said they did. Everyone has a budget. Everyone has a budget. It could be $100. It could be 500. You have no idea what their budget actually is until you ask, until you actually dive into that territory, step out, have a little confidence, and try to find a creative solution that works. And if it's non-exclusive licensing, that may be the best way to get your foot in the door in those early projects without having to sacrifice all your time and energy and get nothing in return.
Absolutely. If I can speak to that a little bit. So, my love of game music, obviously it started as a fan, right? Not as a composer. I think we all grew up playing games and they inspired us and kind of took us on this path. Part of the appeal of becoming a game composer was like, I want like to have my own soundtracks. It was such like a cool idea. It's like I want to have like CDs of my music, just like there's such a draw to that. It's like, man, it's so awesome, like having a whole collection of stuff that I wrote, and that's awesome. And if you can do that, that's awesome. It's probably ideal. But like you said, non-exclusive licensing is not a bad idea. You're not going to be able to release a soundtrack of that music because it doesn't really just belong to that game, but like that's okay. If it means like keeping you busy, keeping you working as a composer, that's so much more important than having like another album on Bandcamp, right? As cool as that is, as fun as it is, to have that, definitely be open to non-exclusivity.
That's great, man. So a subject I really want to talk about, I think is very specific to you and your situation on this whole topic of global work as a composer. What led to your move to Japan? You mentioned 7 years ago you moved there. How has that affected your career, and how has that, just the history of that? This is more for me than anything, but I think it will help others as well, considering how do I make a living if I'm living in some other country or some other state that's not a hub?
So basically the history of me in Japan, I started, my first time here was in 2009, 2010. I came here, I was a university student at University of Michigan, and I did a year abroad at Kyushu University in Fukuoka. Completely, like I said, I'm not related to music at all. I'm not a music major or anything. I'm actually an Asian studies major, specifically Japanese language. So I spent a year abroad here, went back, graduated a year later, and then I ended up getting this teaching job, English teaching job, which brought me back to Japan, to the prefecture of Okayama, which is where I still live. I taught in a small town for 5 years at elementary schools and junior high schools. And I stayed in that town for 2.5 years. I got married, moved into Okayama City, but still taught there. And once my 5-year contract ended, I ended up getting other English teaching jobs at other places. So, my history with Japan was not related to music. It was all, teaching and school related. But I've never not been composing music since coming here. So, like I said, my first soundtrack work was in June of 2013, and I came to Okayama in June of 2011. So my entire professional composing career has been in Japan. Not locally in Japan necessarily, right? Because I've worked with people all over the world, but I have been here the whole time. So, as you were saying, you don't have to live in LA or New York or somewhere with a huge, game dev scene. There's something called the internet. You know what I mean? It's very, very easy to connect with other people. That being said, I do have an interesting story about a game that I've been working on for quite a few years already. This is another one of those, like, one guy is developing the entire game aside from the music. I wrote a note. When was this? June of 2014. I started working with a guy who is from Wales, and he's also living here in Okayama as an English teacher. His now wife was friends with my wife, and my wife had mentioned to her that I was a game composer, and without my wife even knowing this, her then fiance or then boyfriend, I'm not sure how it was at the time, timeline's screwy, but he was a game developer. He went to school for game dev, and he's living in my town. And I was like, all right, hook us up, let's talk. So this is kind of a funny story, and don't think of me as a bad person. Believe me, I'm forgiven for this. But at my wedding party is when I first met him. So during my wedding party, I was over there at his table talking about game development, and that was like the beginning of our working relationship together, was at my wedding party. Yeah, so that being said, Okayama is not a game dev hub in any sense of the word, but be vocal about yourself. Like, hey, let people know that you're a game composer. You never know who knows somebody who's making a game who needs music, I've been very lucky in that sense, in terms of like posting on Facebook randomly and getting a response, and my wife happened to know somebody whose boyfriend at the time was a game dev and lived in my town in Okayama, and he's from Wales, just very, very lucky. But it happens, So even being in a small town, or a town that's not known for game dev, put feelers out there. You never know. And aside from that, get online. Like I said, I've gotten a majority of my work from classified posts. I just put a post up and leave it there. It's there forever, I update it every once in a while if I write some new tunes that I want to share, and that kind of bumps it, and it gets seen. And I've had several people contact me from just classified posts on game forums.
How valuable is your website versus your social media, or do they work in tandem together to help get more projects?
I'm not sure how useful my website is in terms of getting work. I feel like it looks pretty professional. It's a good portal to lead people to if they are for example, if they happen to see my classified post, there's a link to my website, and I'm guessing they visit it and they can see my past projects, hear more examples of my work, and there's a contact form on there. And I have been contacted via that contact form. So I think that if you are serious about your business as a composer, you need to have a website. You have to have some sort of face for yourself, that people can go to. They can contact you. They can listen to your work. They can see what you've done, read a little bit about yourself. I'm not sure how useful it is in terms of like search engines and things. Like, if somebody says somebody types in game music composer, my site's not going to come up. You know what I mean? But it is important to have that portal.
Yeah, and I've been taught that, and this has been super effective for my personal career. I've been taught that the website is the funnel by which social media is basically interaction. It's the relationships you develop with people. And what happens is all of your social media outlets, your Facebooks, your Twitters, your YouTube, etc., it all funnels back to your website. And then your website, if made correctly, and if it represents your style, represents your personality, etc., it should lead others to contact you. Or it should lead others to join your email list, at which point you now have this permanent way of contacting people on a very intimate level that's never going to change, that you can now market to, because email technically is for marketing, it's for selling things, it's for giving away things, but social media is for interacting with people. And so what I've found is, if you can be really creative with using these two things in tandem, they work together. You can't really have one without the other, because you're totally right. No one's gonna, unless they know you or if they heard of you, no one's just gonna go to Google and type in Chris Porter music, right? Unless they've been referenced in some way. They don't know your name to search for your name, and they're not gonna type in game composer. They're gonna pull up thousands of other people, and they're not even gonna put Japanese game composer. It doesn't work. That's not gonna be how people find you. Instead, you use these other outlets for people to find you, you interact with them, and then they funnel down to your website. And I found that to be incredibly helpful along my journey, and I think for anyone starting off, that's going to be really important for them. And I think things I love to see that on your website right now, again, cportermusic.com, you do have all of those links out. You have ways of connecting with people. You have your YouTube channel, your SoundCloud, your Twitter, your Google+, your Facebook. And I think that's really important to show that this is your central hub. This is where people are going to find out kind of the the part of you that is more intimate, that is more personal. And what I think is really interesting as well is a lot of people try to live on SoundCloud or just YouTube or just Facebook. But we live in a world where every 6 months these platforms get updated and their messaging systems change and their algorithms change and people's ability to even see your content frequently changes. But email doesn't change. We might not use it as much, but it's one of those kind of evergreen platforms that isn't going anywhere. And it's not going to change because you have control over it. But you don't have control over Facebook. They can do whatever they want today. Same thing with YouTube. They can just change it. So I've found that email is really that personal touch. And so even what you just told me is that your games have come from those emails because somewhere along the way you funneled them down into your website, which I think is very powerful. Now, I got a bonus question for you here. I know we got to be respectful of time. We got a few minutes left. Just a little fun bonus question. What is your favorite video game of all time? And why?
Oh, it's easy.
Easy.
So my favorite game of all time and my favorite soundtrack, Xenogears.
What?
PlayStation 1 RPG.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's easily the most inspiring soundtrack that I've ever listened to. It's inspired me more than any others.
Was that Yasunori Mitsuda?
It is Mitsuda.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was his first actual completely solo, just him soundtrack. You know, he's really known for Chrono Trigger, and that was his first soundtrack. But there was a couple other composers on there. Uematsu was on there too, right? And one other, I forgot their name, but Xenogears was his first like large. It was just him, and it's a masterpiece. It's absolutely incredible music.
Would you say that has inspired your style?
In a sense, I wouldn't say necessarily Xenogears on its own, but Mitsuda himself. I've listened to so much Mitsuda over the years, even without meaning to. I'm sure that his influence can be heard in my music. Even just in terms of like my tastes, like he uses, he makes great use of like Celtic style, which kind of got me to love Celtic music. So whenever you hear anything kind of like with tin flutes or anything in my music, it's a direct result of him kind of introducing me to that style of music, which I just love.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, Chris, we got to wrap it up so that we can respect time, but thank you so much for being a part of this chat. I know this is going to be really helpful for a lot of people, specifically those starting off. A lot of great little bits of wisdom shared here today. So I know we wish you the best with your career moving forward and staying in contact with you. And for anyone who is not already part of our Sonic Storytellers Facebook group, that's a private group that you can join. And Chris is actually one of the admins. And so we have a lot of cool stuff planned for this year. So if you are not a part of that, come join. And we're excited to have you where you can share your music. We're going to be doing some contests coming up soon and all kinds of fun things. So it's a pretty active group and we're growing. So it's a very exciting time to be a part of that. And so thank you so much, Chris, for your time. And I look forward to sharing this soon.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. I hope we can do this again soon.
You got it.